Hello, I'm the FanFic Critic. I read it, you listen. Recently, I've had contact with an author on fanfiction.net whose story I have reviewed. This author is none other than the infamous Beebee Lovett, who wrote Mrs. Lovett's Lesson, the first fanfic I've ever reviewed. Well, as the FanFic Critic. Surprisingly, she liked my review, which shocked me. I thought she would hate it because of how, I critiqued it and stuff. And she mentioned that she has written another fanfic that I should take a look at. It's called If You'll Indulge Me, Sir. She piqued my interest, so I decided to read it. And you can only guess what my reaction is. So, let's read this story. I know, it's a Sweeney Todd fanfic. This would be my third Sweeney Todd fanfic I've reviewed, but because she brought up the story, I was curious to take a gander at it. So, let's read. Hello again, my sweeties. I'm still in the middle of If Only Angels Could Prevail, and I need a break. So I sat down and thought, what pairings haven't I done? And this came to me, so ha-dee, ha-ha-ha-ha-ha, I wrote it. Sweeney x Pirelli. I can tell just by the pairing that this fanfic is going to be a doozy. Well, I already started, so let's continue. And there's some humor in there for you too, darlings. Please, please, R&R, I'll love you muchly if you do. Well, seeing you don't hate me for my last review, I'm going to safely assume you won't hate me for this review. Special love to my gorgeous, lovely grape nut, and to Twitch if you're reading, love. And here's to our naked Xmas. Okay. I'm going to assume it's between them and... Okay. Lovage to all. This story... Okay, just like with Mrs. Lovett's Lesson, really long author's note, so let's just skip to the actual story. Come in. Pirelli pushed open the door to the parlor, taking in the sight of Mr. Todd, irritably sweeping hair from the seat of his barber's chair to the floor. He smiled slyly. And Mr. Todd, he crooned, in a thick Italian accent. Signor Pirelli, replied Sweeney bluntly, in his very English tone. Okay, she spelled Senor wrong. She forgot the I, so it just says Senor. Let's say it correctly. Signor Pirelli grinned in amusement and spoke again, in a very different voice. Call me Davy. Davy Connor's the name when it's not professional-like, he said slimily. Sweeney frowned in surprise and turned to consider the man standing in the doorway. Davy stepped towards him, still smiling hungrily. I'd like me 5 quid back if you don't mind, he said. Why? Asked Sweeney, trying not to let his surprise and confusion show. Because, smirked Davy, you entered into our little wager under false pretenses, my friend, and so that you might remember to be a little more careful in the future, I'll be taking half your profits from here in. He shot a mischievous grin at Mr. Todd, pulling off the embroiled white gloves slowly. Sweeney still frowned at him confusedly. Share and share alike, laughed Davy, Mr. Benjamin Barker. Sweeney's eyes flew to the man's face in shock. What was the last thing he had That was the last thing he had expected. He was a different person now. Benjamin was gone, and in his place stood his dark, eerie shadow of a man. How had Davy recognized him? Who the hell was he, anyway? He stared at the man uncertainly, then let his eyes drop to the floor, defeat stamped over his despairing face. Don't recognize me, do you? Asked Davy mockingly. And why should you? I was just a little nipper when you hired me for a while, sweeping up hair. He strode across the room and pulled a razor from the wooden box on the dressing table. But I remember these. How could I ever forget you, Mr. Barker? Sweeney looked at him in silence, realization beginning to dawn on him. David Connor. Yes, he remembered now. He shook his head angrily and stared back at his shoes. I used to sit right here, said Davy, setting himself in the window, and dream of a day I could be a proper barber myself. You might say you was inspiration to me." He grinned madly up at Sweeney, who glowered back. "What do you want?" asked Sweeney irritably. He knew there was no escaping this, that he had to give in to the boy's demands, or at least until he had a plan. A safe place he could stash his body once he killed him, but he didn't have to like it. "Like I said, Mr. Todd," laughed Davy. I think she's missing a word. It says his reverting back to his strong Italian voice. It should say his voice reverting back to the strong Italian voice. Half your earnings would do it nicely. Oh, and there is one more thing." He stood up from his seat in the window and walked slowly toward Sweeney. She forgot the E in Sweeney, the one next to the Y, who stood his ground, without flinching. Pirelli stopped about an inch away from him. He was close enough for Sweeney to feel his breath, hot on his forehead. Pirelli snaked his hand down between the two men and cupped Sweeney's crotch through the tight pin-striped trousers. Sweeney looked at him in horror and stepped backwards. "No! Come now, Mr. Todd," chided the man. "If you don't want me to run down the street to me old pal Beetle Banford." Sweeney ground his teeth in fear and agitation, knowing that he would have to do what he was told. It was this or death, and when it came down to it, he was sure he'd been forced to do worse things in Australia than this boy could ask him to do. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Fine," he muttered angrily, feeling nauseous as the sense of foreboding and disgust crept over him, chilling him. Mrs. Lovett never seemed to bloody leave him alone, he thought viciously. The one time it would have been useful to have her burst in on him, yet she stayed quietly downstairs, cleaning, she said. However she cleaned that kitchen, he would never know. You could count 100 insects sitting in that kitchen for an hour. "Good," whispered Davy, smiling crookedly. He snaked his hand slowly into Sweeney's waistband and down, feeling fine, downy hairs. Sweeney closed his eyes and pretended he could feel nothing. "Don't move," he thought sternly, trying to communicate with his penis. "Don't fucking move, or I swear to God I'll cut you off later." Davy grinned as he closed his fist around the older man's long, flaccid member. Sweeney made a tiny, involuntary sound of disgust and squinched his eyes more tightly closed. Using just his thumbs, Pirelli began to stroke the tip of the man's dick, gently tickling it with the nail. "For the love of God," thought Sweeney, "if you think you're going to make me enjoy this, you're wrong." Yet again, he began to send frantic brain signals to his crotch. "Don't you dare. Don't fucking move." Sweeney's orders were in vain. The feeling of Davy's gentle hand on his penis was too much for him to bear. Little Sweeney didn't know the difference between a woman and a 6-foot man. He woke up. Sweeney groaned in irritation and humiliation. Davy smiled triumphantly. "Standing attention to me, Mr. Todd," he cooed into the man's ear. Sweeney gritted his teeth again, refusing to look at Davy. "Don't think this means anything," he growled. "You don't want me, then?" smiled Davy innocently, jerking his wrists sharply. "Don't flatter yourself," Sweeney gasped. Davy pouted and withdrew his hand. Thank Christ, thought Sweeney reverently. But it seemed Davy wasn't finished. With both hands he was now pushing Sweeney's trousers and his underwear with them down his thighs. Fuck, thought Sweeney. Yes, thought Davy excitedly. Alrighty so. And rightly so? Oh, okay. It seemed his talent for barbery was not the only huge thing that Mr. Todd was blessed with. "He's got a big cock and he cannot lie. Those other brothers can't deny." Okay, sorry. "Hello," whispered Davy naughtily, dropping to his knees. Sweeney twitched angrily. Jesus, this was awful. Davy put a hand on Sweeney's thigh and licked the end of his erection, just lightly. Sweeney shuddered. Davy grinned and gently molded his mouth around Sweeney, scraping his teeth against the hard length that now occupied his mouth.